So what is a dungeon? Baldur's Gate 3 offers some interesting answers to this question. Typically, the answer is a specific location with a self-contained challenge and story, but I think the word dungeon can trip people up. To define a dungeon, let's list what a dungeon must have in order to be considered a dungeon. First, a defined space. It must be a defined or otherwise confined location. Now, this could mean a crypt, an asylum, or a cave network, but it could also mean a region of a forest or a bog, or even a cloud city. It doesn't necessarily need to just have one point of ingress or egress. I think a better way to describe this first requirement is that the location needs an identity, separate to the areas around it. You could name it and the people of the world would know what you're talking about. The infested bog, the ruby glade, the waterfall caves. The dungeon is a defined and enclosed place with an identity. Second, it needs to be dangerous. The location does need to be dangerous because if it isn't, then it isn't a dungeon. It's a treasure storehouse. That doesn't mean the dungeon only needs to be engaged with through violence. In fact, a careful party or a clever party could make their way through a dungeon without ever rolling initiative or taking a single point of damage. But that path, like any path through a dungeon, should be difficult, and failure should lead to dangerous consequences. Third, it needs an objective. There needs to be at least one goal or objective. Now, this could be finding treasure, or it could be lifting a curse, maybe rescuing a blacksmith's daughter. This is the driving narrative thrust that makes your characters want to put themselves into one of the most dangerous places in your world. The actual story of the dungeon may end up becoming something entirely different as your players explore it. What starts as a quest to rescue a villager could turn into a dangerous escape when that same villager turns out to be a succubus who paid the local village to send adventurers her way so she can harvest them. But remember, even if the objective changes, there still always needs to be one. So with these three tenets in place, we can identify dungeons in Baldur's Gate 3, and then we can break down what makes them work, and use some of the lessons learned in our own games. Let's start with one of the first dungeons in Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3, the Sunlit Wetlands. Now, this video will contain comprehensive spoilers to this area of the game, so if you haven't gotten to this section and would prefer to experience it yourself, it's pretty early in the game, so feel free to go play it first and then come back. Okay, let's get into it. The adventure hook. Dungeons often need adventure hooks. These hooks are littered throughout your world, and they lure your players to the dungeon. I've often seen complaints from DMs online that players completely skip the stuff that the DMs worked really hard on, and dungeons are often the biggest offenders because they're chock full of content that the DM worked really hard on, and they can be easy to miss, especially if the entrance to them is meant to be somewhat hidden. This is where you need to employ adventure hooks. If your party's the dungeoneering for gold sort, just knowing that there's a dungeon nearby is probably enough to get them to visit. But knowing your characters and their motivations can help you craft adventure hooks that will entice your players to visit your dungeons without feeling like you're railroading them into it. Let's look at how Baldur's Gate gets you to visit their dungeon, the Sunlit Wetlands. The Sunlit Wetlands dungeon begins the moment you encounter two brothers arguing with an old woman named Auntie Ethel at the entrance. Now, this actually may not be the first time you meet Auntie Ethel. You can actually meet her in the Tiefling camp, where she acquaints herself to the party by offering you a free potion of greater healing, and she notices that your characters are looking sick. She invites you back to her home at the Sunlit Wetlands so that she can access the rest of her stores full of unique things, and she can heal you using them. Some of your party members may not trust her, but regardless, this offers you an adventure hook to visit this area of the map outside of just stumbling upon it. There's actually another reason you may want to visit this area. It has to do with uncovering a secret about the druid leader Kaga, which matters if you care about saving the druid grove. The details of that aren't too important to the purpose of this video, and I want to avoid spoiling every little thing, so it's just important that you know that there are multiple adventure hooks bringing your party here, which is a good thing to remember to include in your own game. When you encounter the argument between the two brothers and Auntie Ethel, you overhear that they're searching for their missing sister, and they believe Auntie Ethel to be a witch that kidnapped her. Auntie Ethel denies ever even meeting their sister, which they don't buy. You can side with Auntie Ethel and fight the brothers, because there doesn't seem to be anything strange about this old woman, or you can side with the brothers, at which point Auntie Ethel drops her friendly facade and teleports away.
You were supposed to rush to my defense, love. Fat lot of good you are. Some advice? You ever darken my door, you'd best have that head bowed and an apology at the ready. Bye-bye now.
Bloody hells.
The brothers won't accept help from you regardless and run off into the wetlands to find their sister, and that's the last you ever see of them. Well, they're breathing, at least. When you enter the wetlands after them, you'll get this strange feeling, followed by a prompt to roll and see if anything's amiss. Spoilers, it's very amiss. It's amiss as hell. Even if you skip or fail this check, there are multiple times later in the wetlands that will cause this glamour to drop. So it's unlikely that you'll be fooled by this place's false face for long. When the facade drops, you find out that the Sunlit Wetlands is actually the Putrid Bog, and not for the first time realizing that what you see on the surface may not be what's truly going on. This is actually a really important point to remember when designing your own dungeons: thematic and mechanical consistency. One of the major themes of this dungeon is that things aren't always what they seem. You'll find sheep that are actually redcaps, grass that's actually festering swampland, and a frog that's actually... Actually, I think that's just a frog. Just like a really powerful frog. When designing your own dungeons, think about what the major enemy is and what the story of the dungeon is, and then build thematically around that. For example, if you were playing around with a monster that lived in a mirror, everything in their dungeon would be inverted. Spells that cast fire may now cast water. The whole dungeon could be upside down, and you have to climb over doors to enter new rooms. Maybe to even find the dungeon, you have to pass an innocent goblin village that's being attacked by human raiders, so it's your expectations that are being inverted. It's all about committing to the theme. After investigating around the Putrid Bog, you'll eventually find the Gnarled Treehouse, where you'll meet Auntie Ethel and a pregnant Mayrina, who is the sister of the brothers you met earlier. Auntie Ethel is force-feeding her pie, and if you haven't sussed out that something is wrong with Auntie Ethel yet, her cruel treatment of Mayrina should be enough to tip you off. If it isn't, agreeing to her deal of trading an eye for curing your disease will absolutely ensure that you're aware of what's really going on. Auntie Ethel transforms into her true form, a powerful green hag. Even if you work with her, she isn't able to cure you of your disease, and despite that, claims that she fulfilled her part of the bargain. It's here that you can tell that any deal made with a hag is fruitless, since she has no intention of reasonably fulfilling her side of any bargain. You find more evidence of this later, as deeper within her lair you find victims of her previous deals lying as brutal trophies around a disgusting, gurgling cauldron. There's no obvious way deeper into the lair without engaging with the story here and coming to understand the true nature of Auntie Ethel and her deals. This is a great thing to steal for your own designs, making the way forward contingent on learning more about the story of the dungeon rather than only progressing through killing monsters. When you have the time to get to know the villains of your story, it makes defeating them even more satisfying. To move on, you can put on a mask that puts you at risk of coming under Auntie Ethel's sway, or you can convince some poor soul that's been turned into a door to show you the way to progress. Either option leads you into a fight with some ill-fated adventurers who tried taking down the hag before you. It's such a great power move as a DM to show your players the price of failure, parading in front of them the fates of heroes just like them that met their end, trying to do the exact same thing the players are trying to do. But this isn't going to stop your players, because a player character will always respond, "Respect to your grandma, but I'm different." The final hurdle before the boss battle against the hag is a dangerous descent past poisonous clouds. You can really feel Larian as the DM putting this problem in front of you with no obvious solution, because there are dozens of things you could do to bypass it, from a careful use of Featherfall to not even bothering to try and avoid it and just running through. A good tool as a DM is to craft problems, not solutions. As a DM, I've pretty much simply given up of thinking how my players might get past obstacles I put in front of them, because whatever I think of, what they do is going to be wilder. As a DM, I consider my job in this instance not to say yes to everything, but instead to offer realistic consequences and results to whatever they try. And sometimes what they try actually just works. It's pretty much the same thing here. Whatever you do to get past the noxious gas, you'll end up in the heart of the hag's lair. In the ensuing fight, Auntie Ethel sets fire to the cage holding Mayrina and duplicates herself into 4 illusory doubles that can each act as a powerful hag on their own, but go down to a single hit. The players need to simultaneously find a way to rescue Mayrina and defeat the hag. This is great boss design. As a DM, it's important to design encounters where the goalpost isn't always kill all the bad guys. If that was the case, the best characters would always be the ones that do the most damage. D&D can be more than that. One of my favorite ways I dealt with this was I threw a grease bottle onto the hag, then had Shadowheart silence her, and then Lae'zel use a tripping attack, so she had to use half her movement to stand. She couldn't get out of the grease because it slowed her down, and then the silence meant she couldn't teleport out. While all that was happening, I had Asterion just teleport over with Misty Step and free Mayrina. And that's only one way to deal with this boss. I'm sure there are infinite ways to go about it. Not only is the goal in this fight more varied than simply kill everyone and win, the arena you fight in is really neat. It's like a big ring where the focus is on the deep hole in the center that Mayrina hangs precariously above. There are also sections of high ground in the fight that the hag uses as perches to cast her spells. But you can take these during the fight and steal her advantage. Everything about this dungeon is chef's kiss. Even the ending is amazing. When Annie Ethel is below 10% HP, she'll stop the fight and beg for her life. If you agree, she'll grant you a +1 stat increase, which is insanely tempting for literally any character. All she wants in exchange is her own life. And Mayrina's. If this deal is intolerable to you, then you can make a check to get the stat increase and Mayrina, which honestly feels like the most optimal outcome. At the end, you'll find the hag's personal chambers with notes and potions referencing other deals she had cooking. You can even find the wand that the hag was going to use to revive Mayrina's husband. But of course, things can't ever be that simple. Using it to revive him brings him back as a zombie, which you can either take control of or give to Mayrina. Neither option is super morally great, which I personally love. Regardless, if Mayrina lives, you'll get to finish her story in Act 3, but that is a whole other story. I think there's so many great things you can take away from this dungeon, but if there's one thing I would make sure you take away, it's binding a whole area together with both narrative and mechanics. Let your environment tell the story. One of the best moments I ever had in a dungeon that I built was when my party was investigating a wizard's dungeon and found a block of cells that held those unfortunate souls waiting to be experimented on. Inside, there were 2 skeletons in cells right next to each other, both with nothing but a pair of rings. After an identify spell, the wizard found that these rings were twinned rings of spell storing, meaning that the 2 individuals had to be attuned to them or they wouldn't function. Inside both rings was the spell Knock, which unlocks doors, which is curious since both of these individuals seemed to be locked inside cells and had the means of freeing themselves on their hand. My players shrugged it off. So 2 of the players attuned these rings, and it wasn't until later that they discovered why. When one player cast a spell from the ring, it immediately triggered the hidden curse on the other, casting Power Word Kill on the other wearer. Immediately, the tragic story of this couple trapped in cages played itself out in my players' heads. These 2 knew that they could free themselves from their own cage, but doing so would cost their other one's life. Both went to their graves not casting the spell. I allowed a last-ditch counterspell attempt, which just barely succeeded, meaning that the other player attuned to the ring didn't die. But the story still absolutely hit, and remains one of my players' favorite moments from my last campaign. If you want to hear more about that 3-year campaign I finished, you can check out my last video here. Thanks so much for watching. If you want me to keep doing deep dives into dungeons in Baldur's Gate 3, leave a comment and tell me which one you want to see. I've been Ben DeHart, and here's my dark deal.
Like this video and subscribe, and I'll grant you great power beyond imagining.
Or at least another video next week. See ya.